GM, everybody. Chef Tony here with Doodlifts. My better half of TGID. We are here live from the Flow Hacker House at ETH Denver. We're here with two very important guests. Our guests of honor, Lane and Alex, the two of the three co-founders of Flow. How are you guys doing today?
So good. Really good to be hanging out with you.
Yeah, great to be here.
Yeah, we just got off a nice brunch, wined and dined, and I think...
At 11 a.m.
Yeah.
We wine and dine at 11 a.m.
Hey, those are kind of customs I could get into.
Yeah, Flow fixes this,
But yeah, so we just kind of wanted to, hop on this, this couch here, kick it with you guys and learn a bit more about y'all's baby, right? What you guys created more than, how many years ago did you guys...
This all started in 2017, I would say. That was sort of the beginning of the journey, but Flow wasn't founded until a year fully after that.
Awesome. So do you guys want to go ahead and just give us like the inklings of where you guys started when coming together to create the Flow blockchain?
Yeah, totally. So the origin story comes way before that. Alex and I first started working together under a company called Axiom Zen. Axiom Zen was an innovation studio. We were always messing with new tech. We worked in a basement suite in Vancouver, and it was just messing around with interesting startup ideas and consulting with folks. And one of the folks who worked there with us, Mac Flavel, one day he said, "We got to put cats on the blockchain. We just like the world. The world wants to understand the blockchain. The world loves cats. We got to put cats on the blockchain." And so that it was just at the time one of the many experiments we were running. I personally was working on like a couple different crypto sort of initiatives we had at the time that were much more traditional, like everything people were talking about in 2017. Real estate on chain, summer of ICOs. Everybody wanted to tokenize everything. So there was lots of stuff sort of like going on, but CryptoKitties was among the experiments, and it really came to life after ETH Waterloo, one of the first conferences in fall of 2017 for Ethereum, or maybe it was even the first one I've heard it cited as that. And so a couple weeks later, we launched CryptoKitties right around American Thanksgiving. It completely overwhelmed the network we launched it on, Ethereum. The traffic that we brought in was enough to bring Ethereum to its knees, which actually wasn't very many users. It was like thousands, it wasn't hundreds of thousands, it wasn't millions. We were bringing, at the point when gas fees were too high for the network to be practically usable for lots of use cases, it was like low thousands of people that were really driving that up.
And we generated something like 60 or 70% of the entire, or consumed 50, 60, 70% of the entire platform capacity of Ethereum. Just with that sort of
just with CryptoKitties.
Yeah, just with the experiment.
Wow. Then, yeah, that was just insane at the time, like the dissonance, because you're coming into it and you're reading all these white papers and people like, it's the computer of the future. We're going to run the whole internet, the whole economy. Everything's going to be on chain. It's going to be incredible. And that's the mentality we went into it with, right? Like that's the promises people are making and you feel like it's going to be true. It never, ever one time occurred to us that we would be able to overwhelm the network the way that we did with the cat application.
That you would break the future world's computer with silly cats.
Yeah, absolutely. And people were really upset about it. They were like, this is an important financial tool. How dare you infiltrate it with your stupid cats?
Wait, why does it sound like Ordinal's laser eyes, like how dare you ruin Satoshi's dream? Like it's interesting how things kind of come in cycles, you know what I mean?
Totally. There's
they called it spamming the chain, the Bitcoin chain.
Yeah, exactly. But really, it's just like it's for whoever's going to pay for it. And if people are going to pay hundreds of dollars to breed cats, that's within their right. And so definitely it was sort of like the first illustration of like, oh, maybe the transaction fee model on Ethereum might not be, we're starting to sort of get this list of like, oh, there are some problems with how this works. Because in some cases we were like, that's actually a great point. Like we would love for to not over impact the network if people are willing to wait to breed their cats, but how gas worked at the time wasn't clear to all of the users, and so sometimes they did end up outbidding sort of quote unquote like really legitimate transactions. Yeah, we had reports of people deferring ICOs because of us.
No,
and they were pissed. Yeah, but that was the journey to Flow. Really, it was CryptoKitties.
Now you did tell us off camera that you wanted to stay on EVM. You said you spent 9 months.
Desperately. We spent so many months, me and Alex and a number of folks on the engineering team, Rampton, Leo, Chris, Deet, to name a few, Fabiano, Andrew. We spent months in a conference room reading white papers, trying to find answers on Ethereum or other chains or L2s, Snark, stake channels, you name it, we looked at it. And there was a very concerted effort because we loved Ethereum. We were crazy about it. We were like, this platform is so cool. People can write code and it'll exist forever. Anyone can build on top of it. There's so much community sentiment. Like, we were 100% bought in. We absolutely wanted to stay.
Or well, at least we didn't want to build our own blockchain because we knew it was a technically complex endeavor, right? I mean, other blockchains like Avalanche also started coming out around that time, and we looked at all of them, and be like, okay, in case our dream becomes true of really bringing 1 billion users, to an application that happens to be, running on the blockchain, where would we want to go and not have the platform be a massive risk, or lack of scalability be a massive risk? And we really try to look at more or less all the blockchains back then.
We did talk to because everyone was knocking down our door to be like, come to our chain, like we can help you with it. Because it wasn't lost on everyone in the space that we had this scaling problem. So we were being they were pounding down the door and we heard everyone out. We spent hours with every protocol at the time that we could find that was willing to talk to us. And all of them were just sort of fundamentally willing to make this trade-off around user complexity and DApp interest is like sort of what I would coin it. And they basically were just willing to say like, well, if your users want the application to become more interesting, if they want to do more stuff, you can just bump them onto another shard. You can just bump them somewhere else. Like if they're clogging up the core experience, just divide your community. And we were kind of like, you can't divide the community. You can't divide their assets. That's the whole thing. Like the fact that they're in one experience, having the same experience, experiencing the same breeding algorithm, and having the same fairness of like who's breeding first, that's intrinsic to the experience. We can't break that by forcing some people onto another chain, adding latency, adding transaction fees, adding all of this complexity that's going to sort of change their experience. And so, we just sort of weren't willing to make the same usability trade-offs that folks sort of were encouraging us to, because they were like, well, it's fundamental that these won't scale. But we ended up sort of breaking some assumptions.
Well, Alex, you said something interesting. You said applications that happen to be on the blockchain.
Yep.
Like for you, when you think about applications on the blockchain, is it about the experience first? And is that the primary importance? Is that why maybe what pushed you guys to pursue something like Flow?
So I think there are two answers to your question, in my opinion. One angle is to say, well, okay, so what does a blockchain offer us in terms of like sort of resilience, as an IT infrastructure? What does it offer us compared to other IT infrastructures like cloud or, on-premise computing? And of course, some or many applications are completely good, on a centralized cloud or on-premise infrastructure, but other applications aren't, right? And per se, you can't just say that an application, because it's running on the blockchain, is better. It's kind of tied to the use case, right? But back then, we were actually more sort of concerned with the possibility, with the platform risk or lack of scalability as a platform risk, right? So if you have something good in mind that you're like, oh, this really would benefit, from running on the blockchain, where would you go with such an idea? So that if it actually became popular, it wouldn't just die in its infancy because it can't scale.
Yeah. I mean, so many people are worried about the cold start problem, like how do we get users? But you're saying, if we have a really good idea, we wouldn't want to shoot ourselves in the foot by putting ourselves on a limited platform that can't scale. That's really interesting. So you spend 9 months trying to be on Ethereum. What changes? When do you say we're
building a new box?
Well, critically, it changes only after we expressly promise that we won't build the blockchain. Me and Deet are like, Roham, don't worry.
Famous last
promise, we will not, because, everyone's doing that. We know better. Network effects matter. We're going to stay here. We swear. Nice. And then we sort of wander back with our tail between our legs and we're like, okay, bad news. We're going to have to build our own blockchain.
Or accept the fact that our applications can't scale, right? That's the other sort of real world alternative.
Yeah.
Fair.
That one doesn't sound very good.
No, exactly.
Yeah, so like
It certainly doesn't sound very fun, especially for CryptoKitties. So,
And I think it just came about after we were workshopping in Mario. That was our boardroom name, and they're named after Super Mario characters.
That's awesome.
Gamers at heart.
yeah. That's awesome.
And often the process is just like question everything. So we would sit in a room and just ask questions down to the like absolute base layer until we could like really fundamentally understand something and decide whether or not it was an assumption we had to accept or not. And so we were really deep down this line of questioning around like exactly whose role. Let's go through the life cycle of a transaction as a room. Exactly whose job is it to do every step that a transaction has to go through in order to be considered valid by a blockchain? Everything from ingestion to ordering to execution to finality. And were other terms that chains were using. I'm kind of mostly deferring, I guess, to our terms and the ones that Ethereum has landed on. But there were all these steps, right, that a transaction had to go to before it was considered canonical. And we were like, let's just get really clear on exactly what's happening in these steps, who's responsible, and what the security, performance, and decentralization needs of the step are. Because we cared very fundamentally about all three of those things, like what Vitalik later sort of deemed the trilemma. Mm-hmm. But we started like really breaking the problem open around, well, can you make trade-offs in different areas for the steps of a transaction? And can the balance of trade of some part of the process being responsible for areas of the trade-off and another part of the process enforcing different parts of the trade-off? Can you get all three by sort of specializing what the agents in this life cycle of a transaction are doing? And so we had a breakthrough in this process, in like questioning this life cycle of a transaction process, which ultimately became coined the separation of consensus and compute. We've heard me talk lots now, though. I'll pass it to Alex because he really knows about that. Now, when you say that,
I kind of want to translate it a little bit, right? So you say separation of consensus and compute. You said the agents that take care of different parts of the transaction. Is that what maybe a more lay person might think of, like a node or a validator?
Yeah, exactly. Sorry. Yeah, the agent is a node. In proof of work, you'd call it a miner. In proof of stake, you'd call it a staker or a validator. I used agent for the sake of capturing all of those.
It felt very Matrix. I just wanted to kind of, bring us back.
Yeah, precisely. But that was sort of the changing, that was a turning point.
Yeah, so I think to follow up on the sort of topic you just opened here is when in the, I guess, early, blockchain models, I call those monolithic architectures, like think a Bitcoin, early Ethereum, Solana still follows that model, that you say, well, so we've talked, or Lane has mentioned all the steps, right? Like you need to put a transaction into a mempool, you need to include it in a block, you need to execute it, you need to decide which result is correct, right? Those are all individual steps. And of course, the easiest thing, if you're starting like 10 years or 20 years ago, if you're starting to think about blockchain, right? The easiest is just to say, hey, let's just put it all in one program, deploy it, see how it runs, right? That's generally a very established approach in software engineering. And then later on, you figure out where the bottlenecks are and sort of start tweaking your software, in conventional software designs. You split it up and put it into a microservice architecture. One computer does this, the other computer does that. And I mean, it's not surprising that essentially blockchain evolution followed exactly that same road, right? And we were just at the point where we've now seen, Ethereum sort of the one everything happens in one box, to actually have too many bottlenecks. And in this scenario, we were now thinking about, well, okay, so previously all those things a node did one step after another. Would it maybe make sense that you, for instance, do order the transaction in some way, and while you order the next batch of transaction, you sort of in parallel process the first batch of transactions you've just completed ordering, right? So instead of doing one things after another sequentially, you kind of start a little bit with parallelity, and that also, and if you split that up, the same mindset as with microservice infrastructures, right? One computer has a lot of disks, the other computer has a lot of RAM, right? Because they do different things and their hardware is designed for specifically doing this thing well, right? And we realized that with consensus, blockchain, it's a very similar thing. So for consensus, you want very many participants, because in general, it's not, you can build many blocks and there's not one block is correct and all the other blocks are incorrect, right? You can include transactions, can leave them out. So there are many different options. And so that's an agreement, sort of an agreement process, right? We need to say, okay, this is the batch of transactions we agree on executing next. And for that, you want many participants. You want, the decentralization is very important, that it's difficult to censor, or difficult to just sort of compromise that agreement process. So for consensus, you want very many nodes, while for execution, once you have a batch of transactions and you have the starting state, you might not know the end state yet, but it's deterministically already fixed, right? You just need to say, okay, I'm going to go through the work and then I'm going to necessarily arrive at the answer, what the result at the end of the block is. And there's only one correct result, right? There's no ambiguity. And sort of this realization between, consensus, that's actually an agreement process with very many different correct answers, while execution, that's not an agreement process. There's only one correct answer. And you need much fewer nodes, because you don't want to do the work 300 times, 1,000 times, because that's going to drive up your energy consumption, your hardware consumption, And so this is kind of the intuition behind why we thought splitting up consensus and compute was a good idea. Actually, it was Dietz' sort of realization. And in fact, that has been a paradigm which has been very successfully used in distributed databases. You have this concept of a master node, which is extending the transaction log. So you have essentially a list of things you execute, and then the master node says, okay, we're going to put the next 10 transactions or operations at the end of this log, and they're going to be executed in this order. And then you have a bunch of replicas which observe that log and just sort of follow it along and do the work locally, right? So it's an established mechanism. It just hadn't been applied to blockchain, despite sort of the IT community actually knowing it's a very promising optimization in this area.
That's what my follow-up question, because you said microservices, we split it up based on specialization. It seems like this is relatively standard practice, or at least was discovered in regular software engineering. Why do you think that it hadn't been implemented up until this point on blockchain?
Okay. Yeah. So blockchains, compared to like classical microservice infrastructures, have one subtle but super important additional aspect, which is this sort of entire notion of Byzantine fault tolerance. Let me explain that for a second.
Sure. Yeah, go for it.
So when you think about a classical microservice infrastructure, you have one computer or maybe multiple redundant computers, and you can do an API call, you get an answer, and you assume that answer is correct, right? You ask, hey, what's my bank balance? Your bank says $42, and you're happy, right? You wouldn't assume that your bank would be lying to you, But in a blockchain, we're building an IT infrastructure which we desire to be resilient to actively malicious participants, right? So nodes saying, I specifically on purpose give you the wrong answer to mess with you, screw you over, right? And so that requires lots of additional sort of mechanics to figure out, are they lying to me? Can I prove that they are lying to me? And what happens once I have proven that they're lying to me, right? They get slashed. So those 3 additional steps, that's something we don't have in conventional microservice infrastructures, but that also drives engineering complexity, right? So you want as few of those sort of points where you get an answer from a different node and you have to verify, potentially think about them spamming you, and deal with all this sort of possibility of malicious interactions. That's what makes monolithic architecture, so each node does exactly the same thing, makes that so attractive, right? Because you have the start state of the block and the end state of the block, that's it, and you don't have like 5 interim states where at each point you have to worry about, what happens if somebody is giving me wrong input and how do I prove that? And so I think that's mainly a software engineering sort of complexity problem that we're dealing here with.
That's interesting to think about. A regular network, like you said, you have to be considerate of outside attacks, hacking, quote unquote.
Exactly.
But in a blockchain network, you have to be concerned that the network itself could be malicious. That's really funny. That's super interesting. Just a fascinating problem to think to have to solve.
Yeah, I mean, that problem's not unique to Flow. I think that part of the reason that people didn't think about separating it into different tasks, there was definitely a tribalism. Like the BFT problem that Alex is describing, there was really a tribalism after Bitcoin that everyone run their own node. There was this idea that like participation means that I get to run my own node and I get to participate and anyone can participate. And that is fundamentally important to public blockchains. Undisputably, it was central to the design of Flow. Absolutely, participation and the ability for anyone to both submit a transaction verified is critical. But there was sort of an unwillingness to be like, well, maybe we can break apart the problem of like, what does it mean to trust the network to process my transaction? What does it mean for me to check it? Do I, as a piece of consumer hardware, need to take on the load of processing all the execution state of the network? Because that becomes prohibitive very quickly.
Yes.
Like your chain will always be limited to, well, in decentralization terms, sort of like the 67th percentile slowest node. You gotta wait for your 2/3, and so you're always waiting for that slowest guy. No matter how fast the first guy is, you gotta wait for the last valid consensus, and when everyone is required to process all the state. And so you end up with these sort of like very obvious hardware constraints just from this assumption of like, well, everyone, no matter what device they show up, has to be able to participate. And we did just sort of try and we challenged that assumption because we decided that it was absolutely critical indeed that anybody could submit a transaction, check the result, know indisputably that it was verifiably correct, but that they didn't need to carry the load of all the execution state, and that could be something that you could task others with providing proofs around and lots of cryptographic guarantees for, but you wouldn't have to ask every single participant to take that on in order to feel like they were truly part of a public, decentralized, verifiable, BFT resilient chain. And that, people just weren't thinking about the potential of splitting up that. Yeah, it was sort of a tribalism around the idea, and we weren't willing to break from that at the time.
The culture influenced that.
Yeah.
The tech, which is interesting.
So then in a general sense, to go a little more high level, so when you guys realized this was going to be your innovation, and you're like, okay, we're going to take this route, that was just trying to fix a scalability issue. Like, where did you see, like, on the user side, what this was going to enable?
Yeah. Do you want me to?
No, yeah, go.
Two things. First, scale of the experience, so the size of community it was able to serve.
So how many people can play?
Yeah, how many people can play the same game at the same time, and that's a critical difference. This comes up in auctions a lot, but like, you need to know that your bid's not being front run. And as soon as you start jumping around between L2s or different like state areas, it's very easy for your transaction to be front run because you have to go on one spot and prove that it was generated over there. You're like, oh, hi, here I am. I'm over here making a bid. Is anyone paying attention? And so the ability to be front run on a different chart or on a different layer or somewhere else is like, it's intrinsic to the way the whole thing works, right? Like, you need to be able to prove that, but also because you're proving that, you don't really have any option of being the first one to the auction if you're in a different state space. So one thing was just sort of like really generating consistent experiences for large communities, fair experiences where everyone is able to participate with the same odds in the same game at the same time with the full size of their community. And we felt like the full size of communities was millions of people. It wasn't thousands of people.
Certainly bigger than what fits on an individual computer.
Yeah, that was basically the core assumption. We're like, we think maybe people do things that are a bit more enticing and complex than what would fit on one single computer. Yeah. And the second one was just actually kind of a commitment to sustainability. I would say, and feel free to jump in on the performance things too, because we did definitely need like orders of magnitude improvements in TPS, but that was obvious to the whole space. That was something everyone was thinking about. So the re-architecture definitely gave us that. It gave us a larger shared state space, and it gave us huge improvements in the sustainability of the chain because we had reduced the redundancy of which nodes were doing which work and how often repetitive redundant work was being done. And that's a total game changer for, just like the carbon usage of a network, which we cared a lot about. We designed this chain at a time when people were it was like clear that we had to do proof of stake. We were not going to tolerate proof of work anymore. but we felt like it could go a step further because it was so clear that there was a surplus of redundant work that wasn't serving the security of the chain, it wasn't serving the users, it wasn't even serving the validators. And so, yeah, sustainability was the other really big outcome of that re-architecture.
Okay. So, you said you locked yourselves in Mario, the conference room. Like, ask yourselves a lot of these questions, figured out a lot of these problems. Like, how do you test that theory? Do you publish a white paper? Like, what does that process look like? And what was the response to that as well for the broader community?
So initially we started out with, I guess, a proof of concept sort of application. Fabiano implemented that, I think, with probably Leo and a couple other engineers as help. And so what we did is we spun up a smaller network of nodes across the globe and said, okay, let's assume those nodes are doing consensus. They're saying what's supposed to be executed, but are not actually executing. And then we have other nodes who sit at a geographically different location, who are sort of looking at this list and just following and executing the transactions. We made very simple assumptions about, let's assume a transaction takes something like, 10 milliseconds or 100 milliseconds, just sort of that's a bulk part, and then saw, how does it change if we put execution and consensus on the same machines and say everyone does everything, or split it up? And we saw a pretty significant improvement. I think it was something like a factor of 20. Could that be?
Oh, I think it was higher than that, but we should check the referenced white papers before because it's been a long time. But it was shocking.
Yeah, and then we're like, okay, I guess If you have a result like that, you have two options as a company, right? You can either just sort of go to marketing, or you can go the scientific route, right? And you say, hey, here's the scientific evidence. You also sort of make your results transparent to the scientific community, which can then look at your work and sort of provide due diligence, which is a lot harder if you just sort of engage on a marketing level. And so we wrote a white paper, put that up on archive, and gave that to all the people who were interested in. So that was sort of our process from there.
That's cool. It's cool to hear about that. But yeah, what was the response?
The response. I love this part of the question. The response was, maybe unsurprisingly, that we were absolutely insane. Yes. We got more or less laughed out of every single pitch. So yeah, we work on this white paper, and then Deet and Roham and I are shopping it around to all the folks who had initially expressed interest in sort of like our continuation of solving problems in crypto. At this point, a round had been closed to continue building out consumer IP, but it was clear that any more consumer IP was going to need something like Flow. And so we're shopping around this idea. We're like, look, we have a fundamental innovation here. We really think we're going to need a platform to launch the products that we want to deliver to users. And this is how we have to do it. No one else is thinking about this. And their initial reaction is like, well, if no one else is thinking about it, it's because you've lost your minds. Maybe a good reason. Exactly. You've lost your absolute minds. But it ultimately turned into a situation that I think I'm mostly grateful for, because it did really force us to formalize our thinking. But every pitch that would have otherwise been 30 minutes was 3 hours. Like, we spent so much time walking absolutely every single person that ever got on board in the earliest days through every single step of our thinking. We walked them back through in great detail the competitive landscaping, in great detail the experiment that we were running and why we had sort of proven this key insight, and we had to, because people really did think we were crazy. They were like, if this is so obvious, like, you're saying it now and it sounds so obvious, and so if it's so obvious, why is no one else doing this? And we're like, we don't know, but we really think we need to start like yesterday. So like, the response initially was not great. It certainly wasn't a warm, like, oh my God, you guys are geniuses, you figured it out. It was like deep skepticism combined with some loose encouragement. But later the architecture ended up being sort of revisited by the Ethereum community with everything that is rollups. And so then that certainly was a time for more folks to come on board and understand.
That's interesting that rollups is you said it's a revisitation of that same concept on EVM.
I mean, they essentially do the same thing, right? They say, the layer 1 Ethereum is essentially only the orchestration layer and the reconciliation layer. What I mean with that is that, you can sort of submit blobs of data to Ethereum L1, and then depending on sort of the data availability, for instance, a solution, it would either say, oh, we're including that data blob directly in the block, but the Ethereum L1 nodes essentially completely ignore it, it's just there for record keeping. Or they even one step further, they say, oh, this group of nodes over there, they have a blob of data with that hash, and if you need that data, go to them and ask them, right? So that's sort of the orchestration, right? Ethereum L1 says what is available where and which components sort of provide which services. And if nodes disagree, they can go to Ethereum L1 and ask for reconciliation, essentially figuring out what the correct result is, right? But sort of the actual work of ingesting the transactions and putting them into batches, that nowadays is sort of envisioned to happen on the data availability layer, that's outside of Ethereum L1, and the execution is happening on the rollup, so that's also outside of Ethereum L1, right? And here you really see that sort of same architecture. You have Ethereum L1 essentially provides consensus as a main function for doing orchestration and reconciliation, but the actual work happens elsewhere. It doesn't happen, or the work at scale, I should say, happens outside of Ethereum L1. Data availability at the bottom and rollups at the top. And so essentially we felt very validated, like when you are asking yourself, are we really going crazy, right? Because everyone is looking at us like, you guys are nuts, you're essentially saying, hey, we want to build a blockchain with 5 different node types. That means you're more or less doing the work equivalent to building 5 blockchains, right? Because each of those nodes has to be the full Byzantine fault tolerant sort of, API layer. And and then when Ethereum is now, since a while also moving to that kind of gave us a little bit more confidence and less of the warning voices asking, at least for myself, asking myself,
I'm not crazy. So to kind of back it up a little bit, so you publish this white paper, you're in these 3-hour pitches, what happens next? This is just a genuine curiosity, like after you create a blockchain, what do you do next?
Well, then you decide to break the second promise you made, which is that you wouldn't create another programming language, and then you decide you need a programming language. So,
perfect.
So we realized we needed a blockchain, and then we very quickly realized, in the process of realizing we needed Flow and trying to build it out and fundraising for it, we were still actively building on Ethereum. There was this project called Cheese Wizards. It was like a very simple rock paper
I've heard
scissors
about
duel
Cheese
game.
Wizards.
Yeah. And so we were simultaneously still very actively trying to build on Ethereum, seeing if we could make something work, and still pushing the limits of sort of like what will happen with consumer applications and Solidity. And in the process of launching Cheese Wizards, there were so many bugs that basically the technical team was like, if we're going to the trouble of building a blockchain, we just need a better programming environment for this, because Solidity is great, but it's just not designed to treat things as assets instead of just integers, and resource-oriented programming really treats the things that you're creating to have value, fungible tokens, non-fungible tokens, anything you like. It treats them as something that you would want to be treated like something of value, not just a number. And so it intrinsically treats a cup as a whole cup, and it doesn't drop it on the floor, and there are safety conditions that you can sort of include in Cadence transactions that help ensure that what you expect to happen in a transaction really will. Basically what happens next is that we realize we need a programming language too. And that's the first thing that we launch. So the Flow Playground goes live, and it's a preview of that language. We kind of knew developers would onboard to the language before the platform. Like they weren't gonna choose a blockchain because of the Node software, right? They were gonna choose the blockchain based on the users that were there and the tooling that was available. And so, controversial point, yeah. So we really went to work in creating this basically developer preview of Cadence, the programming language, and we called it the Playground. We launched it in 2 months or something obscene, a very short time. Mm-hmm. But folks liked it. They looked at it and they were like, this is intuitive. This makes sense. Please give it to us. And so that was sort of milestone number 1 in shipping what would later be the blockchain that Top Shot shipped on.
While in the background, we were already building sort of on an early version of Flow, starting to get individual node software started, and
So Cheese Wizards was kind of the last attempt on EVM. What was the first project on Flow, or maybe project of significance?
Top Shot. Top Shot was the really, really big one. They were our first
NBA
testers.
Top Shot.
Sorry, NBA Top Shot.
TM.
Yeah. Well, because it was meant as, like we were never going to ship on or promise to anyone that they could ship on something that we didn't feel like 100% confident in. And so we really, at first, when Flow was in beta, which is when Top Shot launched on Flow beta.
Wow.
And so we were only willing to do that with, people who were close enough to us that wouldn't be mad when something inevitably went wrong, because this network was a baby and no one had ever attempted a 5-node network before. So like the surface area for stuff to go wrong was just so high. And so we just a brief bout of PTSD. I'm sorry. I just went somewhere else. And then it was mayhem.
When the millions came.
Yeah, so Top Shot was the first thing to launch on Flow beta and it was also Top Shot beta. A couple months after that, there was a group of folks called the Open World Builders, and these were just people who had been in the community since CryptoKitties, basically, among other folks, but they had just sort of really followed us closely and wanted to start building, and so they also shipped applications, but none of those were nearly as famous as Top Shot.
Yeah, I mean, not to overlook it. I mean, when I'm an NFT guy, right? That was how I got into the space. And anybody who's anybody right now, a lot of those people came on chain through Top Shot. Like, how does that feel? I don't know, like, how many people you were on, like, oh, yeah, it was Top Shot. Oh, yeah, it was Top Shot. Like, those are considered, like, the OGs, right? Yeah. And you guys were just like, oh, hey, let's get the NBA involved, right? I mean, cultural significance, like, just I mean, crazy. Like, how does it, I mean, when you look back at it, I mean, when you're in it, right, you're just like, it's on fire, right? But how does it feel looking back at it now, and knowing what?
It sounds like a bit of a mixed bag, though, from your reaction.
Well, I would say it was the right move back then. I mean, that's actually, we wanted to show that we can build a platform where you can run a scalable experience, right? And what is better than actually having a scalable experience to sort of underpin this promise? Yep. So, but on the other hand, usually, when there's sort of marketing and time constraints, you just got to ship, and things aren't going to be necessarily ready or even perfect, at the time where you ship, and then, as Murphy's Law goes, stuff breaks, right? And as Lane said, that's also one of the reasons, that was very important for us, where we really felt that it was important for us to differentiate from the broader space, right? The broader space was very much about hype, finance, sort of big promises. A lot of players weren't really sort of, I would say, honestly talking about what is a promise and what is a reality now, right? They were talking about things they were betting on or thinking that they could realize it in 10 years, but not telling people about that, and sort of making it look like that was already the reality of the day. Mm-hmm. And we said we wouldn't do that. We would not expose users or builders to undue risks based on our promises, or sort of, I guess maybe an IT infrastructure which wasn't as durable as we were hoping it to be. And so initially we actually said, no, you have to talk to us, before you can put your stuff on Flow, because that's first an opportunity for us to make you aware as a builder, that this is not perfect. It's still an alpha or beta version, and also for us to mitigate potential risks of exploitations where we didn't have the code in place yet to sort of mitigate or close those loopholes on an algorithmic basis. And we're still relying on essentially humans, to be like, oh, no one is shipping a malicious experience on top of Flow or running a malicious node inside the network at a point where we couldn't yet tolerate it. The sort of this entire process of bootstrapping, of shipping things, and building sort of while you already use the product. And that created a lot of like late nights for the team. We had this, our Khan, one of our team members, had this famous saying of the great mainnet fires of 2020, when sort of the load just tipped the network over the edge, not because it was like a malicious attack. It was just that, things, when you have a lot of load on a system and things don't work quite as perfectly, at one point it will break. And, of course, that's, when you get your pager duty in the middle of the night being called in and be like, oh, consensus has already, the timing has already sort of desynchronized and they're not producing blocks anymore. And that was the point where that's much later than when we were like, okay, I guess we have to put the next algorithm in place, right, which now automatically handles this and remove the need for human involvement to fix those edge cases.
How many users are we talking about? Like, because my impression of Top Shot is that it kind of went gangbusters. Like, so did you go from 0 to what? When did you start kind of experiencing load issues or other issues?
Oh, when did we start experiencing? I mean, the first drop, I think the first drops were probably like in the order of like 5-figure groups of people. And those were not too bad. Those were pretty fine. It was when we started marketing. The team had developed such a fear of marketing because it was pretty okay at organic levels. If we tell people
about these drops, they might show up.
But then it was like as soon as we started telling people about drops, we were like, can you guys tweet like half as much? Well, do you remember the TPS? What TPS we were hitting when we would hit fires back in the day?
Well, I don't know, maybe 30 TPS, 50 TPS. I don't know, maybe it was less. For
context, when we were dealing with CryptoKitties on Ethereum around the same era, you could get like kind of 8 to 15 TPS. So 50 TPS without any optimization on the sort of just brutest version of the platform, getting 50 to 60 TPS was like pretty good. That was fine. That was still a win. That was still way better than we were getting on Ethereum, even though in now today context seems slow, but the current performance numbers are significantly higher. But it was around the hundreds of thousands of users, I would say, that we like really were inundated and overwhelmed, not just by network activity, but
I gotta
Discord.
I gotta imagine as a new blockchain, you're working with the NBA. Do you feel like pressure to perform? Like, what does that feel like to work with an organization like that? Do you feel like you're representing the blockchain space as a whole? Like, what does it feel like to be that team? And how big was that team? Like, how do you manage that load?
Though, yeah, I guess I should emphasize those teams were always really separate. So Flow has always been its own. There was always Dapper Labs doing consumer applications in the world of blockchain and crypto, Web3. The terms have evolved over the years. So they were always doing that with big IPs. And Flow was always meant to be a primary service provider to them, Dapper, because they needed us to be able to ship the applications they wanted. But Flow also had other sort of, big companies building on it. And so Dapper, I would say, more was interfacing with the partner situation, and our interaction with the situation was in some ways very similar to any other sort of like main network that has a big application deployed to it, where like sometimes we wouldn't get a heads up about the drop. Like I would find out that there was a mainnet fire because we had hundreds of thousands of people showing up because it was on Twitter, it was on PagerDuty, like the network was showing us that it was overwhelmed. But I don't know. I don't think that, at least on the Flow team specifically, there wasn't a huge, the obligation was to represent the space well and was to deliver on a promise that we were going to give them something wholly new and unique and interesting and original for their community and fans. And we all very much wanted to make good on that promise. But in terms of sort of like, we didn't interface with them sort of like face to face often enough. That was folks' jobs who gratefully weren't us. That
makes sense. No, I think that makes sense. And I often forget that there was like a Dapper wallet on ETH. Mm-hmm. So that pre-existed Flow, right? Yeah. So, that makes a lot of sense. There's a separation there.
And then so in a general sense, right, you're talking about like how the technology got there, what, you guys had found an issue, you created a solution. And now one thing that also comes with a blockchain and doing all those things is governance. Mm-hmm. When did that conversation get started? And
before the beginning.
Okay.
Yeah. Governance started before the beginning because it was something that we really didn't feel like anyone had nailed yet. and there also wasn't enough data for. The performance problem was different because it was like, you know, the industry hadn't really settled on an answer, but we were starting to get good data points of where the failures were. Governance didn't feel like it was anywhere close to that. There was like some ideas of how these things would be governed in theory. There was sort of Maker quite famously had like quite a governance situation. I'm not going to get into that, but it was very clear to us from the very beginning that like a public blockchain is its governance. The assurance you have that it's going to continue existing is knowing that the people who are in charge of doing the things the protocol can't are going to continue to do those things in perpetuity, or they're going to entrust a group of people to make sure they happen. And so we were in some ways like looking for a governance group as much as a protocol. And I would say that I still think about that problem every single day. I still don't think that actually at lunch we were kind of talking about like some auction problems which are related to governance. And the conversation started at the very beginning, and it's one that we always asterisk with like, this needs lots of room for improvement. The term that we use for like, keep it flexible and keep improving it, because it hasn't been nailed, and we need to make sure it is absolutely to the highest standard, because it's the thing that, just like ultimately humans will still always be a part of this stuff, and understanding how they relate to the system and making sure that that's verifiable, fair to all the community members and participants in it is a problem that we take so seriously. We're still solving it like many years later.
And could you just speak a little bit towards like how the process nowadays works? Like how you guys are coming together and like where like what you guys are doing to steward it forward?
The Flow community now has working groups, and so they own sort of different areas of the protocol. There's one for protocol, there's one for tokenomics, there's one for the programming language Cadence, there's one for governance, and so governance for governance, but
very meta.
Yeah, basically the governance at the moment is leadership by community initiative, and so the working groups are meant to surface the problems that the sort of ecosystem and chain are facing, the best solutions for that regardless of where they come from in the ecosystem, and governance is just sort of the process of ensuring that those folks have the resources at the whatever surfaces through the working group, that the resources to solve the problem that they identify are made available. And so there's a treasury with a multi-sig on it, and a non-binding vote process basically that sort of indicates where prioritization of resources should go. So as of right now, it's transparent and open, but very much like there's a multi-sig involved, but pretty hands-on still, very, very people-to-people, community-based, lots of soft consensus through conversation.
And is there like a way that people like, could you talk a little bit towards how people join those working groups, or like, is there people overseeing participation?
Thank you so much for seeding a call to action. Luke's going to be so happy. Yes. If you would like to join a working group, there is.
Join the Discord.
Yeah, exactly. There is a Discord. So you go to GitHub on Flow, and then there is a page on the main page for working groups. And for whichever area of interest that you would like to join, there is both a Discord chat and tends to be bi-monthly meeting. It seems they sometimes meet on different cadences, but there is a link you can join and hear what folks have to say. There's no obligation to talk, but always welcome questions and answers when people have them.
Right on.
Hey, there you go. If you want to participate in governance, head of the working group.
Yeah.
Now I heard you say that, governance is something that you're still trying to solve, which I think even just hearing that from like a co-founder of a blockchain, that it's not perfect. It's still improving, and there's still room to grow. Like, X amount of years later, like how many years has Flow been around at this point?
It launched in 2019, right? Yeah, late 2019, right before COVID. Right before COVID. Actually, no, we launched it during COVID. Flow launched June of 2020. The playground, that's how we remember. The playground was launched with Cadence, the first milestone I alluded to. That was the day that we all were sent home for quarantine.
I believe that.
Actually.
Yeah.
And so
timeline matches up.
Yeah, which is crazy. And that was the last time we all saw each other in office. And then it was like 3 months later, June of that same year, that beta mainnet launched with Top Shot.
Gives a whole new definition to like heads down building. You know what I mean? Like.
Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
But so you continue to learn more, or like improve on the process of governance. You encountered a lot of probably, I imagine, expected issues in beta, right? Just learning, like, how has that process been? Like, what have been some of the major learnings since Top Shot, since then? Like, How has it been since that?
Yeah, I guess we do have to circle back on the how was it question. So
yeah, I heard the fires of mainnet fires of 2020. So like, what happens after that? What's the recovery period like? You know?
Yeah, the recovery period is long and tumultuous, I would say. It's been surreal. I would say overwhelmingly we are all grateful to have. It is a wonderful problem to have when you have users who are excited to use a product so much so that you're crashing the thing. And it's a wonderful problem for people to be yelling at you on Twitter, even if, I mean, ideally they're not yelling, but if they are, you know, you've struck a chord, you're delivering something they care about. And when you get past the like initial anger and frustration when folks are maybe not getting exactly what they want, on the other side of that is just like the invaluable insight of exactly where things break. Because only when you really push something to its breaking points do you see the stressors. And so it's been just such a gift to know like exactly which problems needed to be solved. Like it really moved, moved performance way up on the list, which is phenomenal because that absolutely ended up being a vertical that folks wanted to compete on sort of in the more immediate time frame than, for example, decentralization, which was definitely talked about when we first launched things. So on the other side of that, I guess, is just like really compelling user data of like what are people actually doing, what are they interested in, and what do we prioritize based on that. We otherwise could have done any number of things, but I think Flow kind of found its initial niche, helping to serve people who really cared about digital assets and wanted to build community around them. And we're just continuing to see versions of that evolve, like versions of that core Top Shot collectible experience and community growing into other sports IPs on the chain. So it's been intense, I would say.
You've probably added, a handful of sports IPs to the chain? I mean, not just small ones?
Yeah,
that time?
Yeah, absolutely. All Day is really popular at the moment. I think La Liga is still around. The UFC Strike was on chain. There was a number of cricket in India really did great. So yeah, tons of sports IP on the chain. Certainly there was a complementary audience. You could sort of say that found other content they were excited about.
And it's not only sports now. We've seen like Disney and things like that with Disney Pinnacle and other things like that come on chain. So it's been great. Yeah.
So and maybe the central theme I'm seeing here is a lot of legacy IPs coming on the blockchain to create digital collectibles using Flow as the substrate to do that. You know, like you said, as Dapper making the partnerships to be able to say, hey, look, we got, you know, our wallet. It's like a little bit of a walled garden. Like you guys are safe here. Now, what is y'all's like opinion or view on incubating Web3 first IPs, right? I know you guys, Doodles is building the studio there. So like that, I mean, we stand Doodles. We like the Doodles. But so that for me, that's exciting to see them do that. How do you guys feel about that in general?
Oh, so positively. Oh my God, so positively. Yeah. You use existing legacy IP because it's something people recognize and it's easy to onboard to and stuff. But we really did design, with legacy IP, you always deal with sort of porting over existing licensing issues. And that's fine. That's part of onboarding, sort of the old world to the new world. But it's so much more fun when it's new Web3 IP, right? Because you just get to like from scratch, let them mint it on chain. They have royalties, right? Like they can start doing enforcement around the transfers and use of their assets right away. Like everything is so natively set up to work exactly how you would want it to on chain when they start there. So I would say overall, just so positively, especially because Flow's ownership model is like so intrinsically designed for creators and for original sort of attribution of IP to go back to an account rather than an application, the user's account. So just so bullish on creators in general, creators owning their content, doing that on chain when they can, being compensated for that and building their communities. And it, would love to see more of them on Flow. But in the meantime, if it's legacy folks, happy to see them too.
I want to key in on something because you mentioned the ownership model, and we were talking off camera about this. Could you maybe, illustrate, we use like the safety deposit box analogy. Could you illustrate the difference between owning something on Flow versus owning something on something like Ethereum?
And something you mean an NFT right now, for example.
Could be anything.
Okay, could be anything. Ownership works the same way. Right. So there's sort of three, and Alex, please feel free to jump in at any point and correct me, but there's sort of three ownership models. Bitcoin uses UTXO, and so that's sort of like a ledgered list model. Ethereum expands on that with the contract model because it adds lots of complexity. So it says an address doesn't just have a balance, it can have all kinds of other stuff. It can have functions, it can have smart contracts, it can have state, it can have stuff, right? Like it can have an NFT. And Flow takes sort of both of those ideas and evolves it into something called the account model, where you don't lose any of those attributes, but rather than the ownership being what it is in the contract model, where it's like, I, as the application, am going to point to the attribution of assets. Sorry, I shouldn't I'm going to point to who owns which assets based on a list that I have. Flow says you will hold your assets in your account and you'll link to the DApp. You'll talk to the DApp and they will point at your stuff, but it'll all live in your account. It won't live in their application. So the analogy I sometimes use is it's the equivalent of like, is the store that you're shopping with saying, hey, yeah, this is your shirt and you can try it on. And whenever you want to wear it, come into our store and you're going to love it. It's going to be the best shirt you ever have. And that's Ethereum. And then you go on Flow and you buy a shirt and you're like, oh my God, this is the best shirt ever. And it comes home with you. It comes home in a bag, in your account, in your wallet. It goes in your house. It goes in your closet. It's yours to use. It comes with you the ownership is attributed to your keys, your account, your address. It's not attributed to an application's idea of ownership that's pointing to you. And so the difference, that sort of fundamental difference really changes how interoperable things can be and how much agency users have to move between different applications. And so at the moment, when people have very relatively simple dApps, you don't notice this as much. But when you are trying to take a doodle with a full collection of clothes into a whole new town, you start to really notice if the town application and the backpack application aren't on the same page.
I can bring my own clothes to the town.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think most importantly, you can also give somebody else the permission to modify the clothes which are in your account, as opposed to if the clothes still live in the account of the DApp that has originally created the Ethereum model, right? You need to talk to the creator, right? You as a user cannot decide what is happening with the stuff you own, right? Like CryptoKitties is a very good example, right? If you want to put a hat on the CryptoKitty and modify the CryptoKitty in some way, if you own the CryptoKitty in an account model, that's for you to authorize. While in the Ethereum model, it's more or less for the DApp to authorize what can happen with the assets.
That's really interesting. I like the T-shirt store model, and I think just to illustrate it another way, I think one of the examples we were talking about outside, it's the difference between having a few bucks in your wallet in your back pocket and having a key in your pocket to a safety deposit box down the street at the bank.
Yeah, exactly. And the values are the same. It's $3 in both cases, but the accessibility of the $3 arguably drastically changes its value, right? In one case you have to go walk for $3. In the other case you have to put your hand in your pocket for $3.
It's an issue of custody, right? We make such a big deal about self-custodying your assets, not your keys, not your crypto. So I feel like that's important.
Absolutely.
An important distinction.
Critical distinction, absolutely. Yeah.
But one that maybe the average user is not aware of.
Indeed, not aware of it. And I would never want to split hairs on saying that you should care about this as a user,
Sure.
but as a user you will care when applications start limiting what you can do. When you feel like your stuff comes with you in the internet, like it would on Flow because the account model would bring your assets with you, that's going to start to feel way better than when you're on a different application and you log in and only your PFP is there, but the accessories that come with it aren't or something. Mm-hmm. And so starting to just illustrate to people that their online world can be as cohesive as their physical world, I think is how you start to sort of bridge that gap. But not your keys, not your crypto is an argument that I've made for many years. And in some cases it's just not the one to win on because people are like, this doesn't impact me. But it does start to impact them when they realize they don't have their stuff with them in a very concrete way.
Yeah, I mean, I think, a lot of us, if you dive down, the self-custody rabbit hole and this idea that, I can bring me and my assets to wherever I want to go on the internet, right? That the difference between being like, I have a backpack full of my stuff, or I just have a key ring full of keys to a bunch of other places, right? And I think the idea that I can pick up my stuff and go if I want to, that's appealing to some people and important to some people. But what I hear is on Flow, you have these incredible user experiences that just so happen to also ascribe to these maybe more pure blockchain values. Is that an accurate kind of description?
Yeah, I think applications are generally encouraged to be composable and interoperable on Flow, certainly. Yeah, there's sort of core IP experiences, and then folks build in and around that to sort of extend the experience. And yeah, I would say that is a fair assessment of the ecosystem. You're not forced to build that way, but because the account model makes things so inherently modular, it's naturally very easy to build in a way where applications can be independent and then talk to others and all tapping into the same user base.
Awesome.
A side aspect to this entire conversation might also be that it makes executing higher transaction volumes a lot easier. For instance, if we're two, making a trade of some, let's say, NFT Top Shot moment, and you two are making a trade, right? Technically, our trade only touches your account and mine, right? Because we do not need to go through the Top Shot account, right? While if all the assets live on the Top Shot account, and we make a trade and you make a trade of independent assets, a priori, it's very hard for a computer to say those are independent assets. I can just execute that independently. No, most likely the computer will say, oh, they're touching the same list, right? The list of all the NBA is of for instance, all the CryptoKitties on Ethereum, and therefore, since they're both touching the same object, I can't parallelize them. And so this account model also makes parallelity, higher transaction volume, in more cases, a lot more, or actually tractable in the first place.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, if we're all making transactions on the same contract at the same time, no, let's do mine first. And so, what I'm hearing is Flow in the team, was making a revolutionary product with a relatively probably small and scrappy team, right? And I think that maybe a lot of people might not know that part of your story. And also, too, this is something we were discussing earlier. If you think about it like a software product, because you mentioned we're taking these learnings from software engineering, like the microservice model, and really looking at the Flow blockchain and realizing that it's still super early, and judging it any other way would just be doing it a major disservice, in my opinion. It's like looking at Windows 98 or Windows XP. And I don't say that to downplay what you've done, but I'm saying it to say that there's so much room to run, and to say this is as good as it's going to get. That's kind of crazy, right? We look at these other products, and in the tech review world, they say oh, this is the worst version, is the current version. It's only going to get better, right? How do you see that happening for Flow? And where does Flow go from here?
All right. I think that is an awesome question. Thank you. So in this context, it's very important to me to mention two things. So fully agree, we're very early. And as I hinted on earlier already, that Flow's architecture also requires us to build more software, right? Because it's a multi-role architecture. And for us, it's super important that we do not expose users or dApp developers to risks, undue risks, or make things very complicated for them so that it's easy for them to shoot themselves in the foot. That's not the experience we want for dApp developers or users. What we want them is that by default things are safe, and that they can sort of invest their brain capacity into making their experience great, as opposed to working around limitations of the platform. I mean, honestly, which software engineer likes that, right? And so in a lot of cases, we've sort of substituted functionality which ultimately should be handled by software now in an interim step by humans. And that's what you mean, what you kind of mean with it's early, right? There's a lot of things for us to build, but we want to emphasize that the things we haven't built, we specifically ask ourselves the questions, okay, so how can we have those things not built, while at the same time not letting the user or developer sort of shoulder the risks of those things not being there, right? So that's one of the examples why initially we only started with big brands. We said, we can't just have any arbitrary guy deploy software on Flow, because the system itself is not ready to handle adversarial smart contracts. So we had to work with a few bigger sort of projects where this would make sense, that we sort of work with them hands-on. And then later on, we opened up Flow. The next step is we're going to open up more node participation for anyone to run nodes. At the moment, you can only run access nodes, which are the nodes which essentially provide the external-facing APIs. The reason, again, is that we don't want to expose users or developers to undue risk. And at the moment, we're still working on making those node software so resilient that it can handle an arbitrary attack. And so, we still have a long way to go. But sort of not selling the product or the platform we have at the moment, not selling it for the perfect end thing, pretending that it's already perfect. There's no risk, we want to be open that there are limitations, and that we're sort of substituting some of the things we haven't built in software by humans. And that is by design and by choice. Because otherwise we could either not let anyone on the platform, or we would have to essentially create a false promise that it's already all perfect. And we don't want to do that.
Just say, it's immutable now, and it's fine, and it's perfect, and just have at it.
Yeah.
Jeez. I do want to hear, maybe in kind of closing, dream a little bit. What is your ultimate dream and vision for Flow? Where does it end up? What does it look like to you? What gets you up in the morning when you think about that,
Yeah, well, in some ways, doodles. Because I really think the future of, well, hopefully just Web3, but I really think Flow is so well suited to it because of the account model we were talking about. But it's a different kind of social experience. It is an internet that I don't fear. It's an internet where it feels free to me. I think that the user experience of free needs to stay, but the cost of sort of selling my privacy and my data to make that be the case, like that trade-off is not allowed to exist anymore. And so I would dream of social networks and information networks and news feeds that felt like they were really making me a better person, like they felt like they were full of real information from real people that I really knew, and they were full of algorithms that had been peer verified and content that had been verified, peer reviewed, and shared with the people that I trusted and sort of opted into hearing from. So my absolute dream scenario would be creators like really embracing the idea that they can own their content and they can hold the attribution and attestation for their work, and they can be compensated for that, and that would be an internet where we're not the product anymore. We are a group of peer-to-peer individuals who are sharing stuff, but it is not up to advertisers anymore to be making decisions about what we do or don't see based on where they want our money to be spent. So, if I had to like really dream, it would be all new social. It would be an internet that people weren't the product on.
Yeah, if you don't know what the product is, you're the product.
Yeah, precisely. Unfortunately.
What about you, Alex?
So, by the way, I really like your vision, and I very much sympathize with it. What I really like Flow to sort of be used for is computational use cases that might require a little bit of an explanation. So currently, when you talk to people about blockchain, Web3, the first thing what comes into their mind is tokenization, value management, ledger, which essentially also just means just a database, right? People usually don't think about, can I run computation on there? If you think about, or if you remember CryptoKitties is actually a relatively rare class of NFTs in that it's not just a thing which is static. No, it has functionality. You can take two CryptoKitties, breed them, and get an offspring, and the offspring inherit some mixture of traits from both of the parents, right? So it's kind of in a computer science language, it's more an object which has functionality and data attached to it as opposed to just a data container. And I really personally like those use cases, and I think blockchain is really great for those. It's a computer. Ultimately, it's more an operating system than a database. And we've built Flow to be hopefully a very scalable computer. And so I'd love to see a lot more of those use cases, NFTs which can do something, but also applications which link the blockchain to our real world. Like, for instance, why not have the blockchain decide when it's a good price for your electricity so that your electric car tomorrow morning is charged, right? You don't need it to be charging now. It can charge at night or maybe very early in the morning, as long as it's done, by the time you want to go to work. And sort of this decision algorithm, right? It's relatively simple computation, but it is computation. And to have something like that on the blockchain, where the blockchain actively interacts with the real world. Because remember, a blockchain is a highly secure computing platform, probably much more secure than your computer at home or even a cloud instance. And so, if we use that to sort of control things in the real world, we have a relatively robust sort of software or IT platform, where you can run computation for critical infrastructure like electricity grids on, when to charge your car, and going back to what Lane said, without giving all that data about when you're charging your car, when you're running your dishwasher, without giving that to a big company so that they can better profile you and give you the better targeted ads, I think that's where really sort of the blockchain, as both a decentralized as well as a highly resilient infrastructure, really can play out its strengths.
That's really cool. That's really cool to hear. It very much has like I say this, like an old blockchain spirit, like we're going to revolutionize the internet. You just don't hear a lot of that these days when people are talking about blockchain products, to be fair. A lot of them are very niche or whatever. Maybe they don't have that soul to it, if that makes sense. So it's just cool to hear you two talk about it, especially being the founders and being so passionate about it. It's like, how can you not win,
Real problems, real people always. That was the mantra that I used to just either write it on the top of a whiteboard or petition it at the beginning of a meeting. But definitely there is the old world spirit in the team of solving old problems in new ways and doing that with a fundamentally different technology and really committing to the ethos of how, even in some ways are like early Bitcoin maxis would, like really decentralization is absolutely fundamental to everything we do. Transparency, verifiability, like the old world of why we wanted Web3 definitely lives well here, but we'd like to show it to people in ways they recognize.
I think people would be surprised to hear you say that, which is why I'm glad to hear you say it.
Thanks so much for saying that.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, like being the artists and the scientists of the future is pretty cool, like the kind of the astronauts of our time is where I kind of, pin you guys. And I really do appreciate like what you guys do for the entire ecosystem and are enabling these types of experiences. Like you said, it's really, there's so much potential, and I'm really glad to see at least Doodles working with you guys. I think the studio is going to be really, if I forecast the next big thing, right? The markets are heating up. I think that, like you're saying, they're really trying to innovate with what is possible. And that's what I like, right? Like innovators, let's stretch it. Let's reimagine it. And you guys have given that to them. And it's, I'm just so excited. It gives me goosebumps thinking about it. And, just core cool people. The vibe check has been really good here in Denver. Like, I'm so glad that we got to connect, and really thankful that we got to have this conversation with you guys here.
So grateful you guys came out. Yeah, it's been such a pleasure. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks so much for the conversation.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Lane, Alex, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And, be on the lookout for what's next from Flow Blockchain.
And if you have a problem, never forget that Flow fixes this.
All right. Bye, everyone.